Okay. Hi, y'all. We are a little late, but we are here and we are going to have conversation with each other. Today, we wanted to talk about Black mental health specifically because today is Black Mental Health Day in Toronto. And as we know, Black mental health is such an important topic, specifically to talk about in the context of Toronto. And as well as we wanted to focus on generational trauma and grief because there's so many things that we definitely have to grieve about at the moment that has happened since the beginning of 2020. So we wanted to really tie in how we're navigating grief and what are the ways that we can navigate grief. I am Tanya Turton. I am the founder and the executive director for Adornment Stories. And I'm so excited to be able to sit with you and do a little lunch and learn and conversation today and hopefully bring more awareness to Black mental health, but also leave some tools and tidbits that you can implement into your own life. So if you're watching this, either it's now or if you're watching it later on, as we will always do, we leave the lives up for at least 24 hours. And you can also watch back our lives on our YouTube channel if you want to catch up to what we've talked about in the past. Okay, so let's get right into it. What is generational trauma? What does that even mean? Generational trauma really speaks to the experience of not only trauma that has happened in our current day-to-day life, because sometimes generational trauma is connected to our day-to-day life. So intergenerationally, it might be connected to traumas that our parents or our guardians and caregivers have experienced, and how those traumas can also impact what our lived experiences are and what our traumas in our day-to-day life are. As well as generational trauma can look like the experience of, specifically, I guess, the experience of systems and the ways that systems impact particular communities intergenerationally. So thinking about the Black community and some of the things that we've experienced and what the systems are that continue to perpetuate anti-Blackness, for instance, and how, so whether that's economically speaking in the job market, or whether that's housing and where we get housing, or it's food security and where we're able to access our food, all of these things can impact us not only in our day-to-day lives, but impact us intergenerationally through our experience of continued oppression, really and truly. I'm trying to find like how do I say this? It is what it is, a continued oppression based on these systems. So sometimes we're dealing with something that it feels like it's so hard, and we're trying to figure out, we're dealing with something that feels like it's so hard, and we're trying to figure out for ourselves what it is. We're trying to figure out for ourselves, why is it so hard to access housing? And it can start to feel like it's something that is a discrepancy of ourselves. And then when we are able to look at our histories, we're able to see the ways that systems have intentionally left us out of affordable housing conversation, so, and that is a mental health concern, and that's definitely a mental health issue in terms of how that impacts our mental health. So talking about generational trauma is so deeply important because it allows us to contextualize some of our experiences and not feel so much like it's just about us and that we are in some way failing ourselves. Because pairing that with some of our mental health challenges and issues, we can start to feel like we're not doing something, that there's something that we are doing inadequately, and therefore that is the reason why we're having an issue trying to access care for ourselves. Also, some of the ways that intergenerational trauma can show up, I think that something that my partner says often is our issues live in our tissues. And some of those ways that things show up is that we're dealing with not only our trauma and what we need to heal from, maybe sometimes even our own childhood experiences, but sometimes things that happen in our parental unit's childhood and the ways that they are reacting or re-traumatizing or re-sharing that trauma in a lot of ways. And so we're not only dealing with what it is for ourselves, but we're also dealing with what it means within our family unit and continuing to have the same experiences, and that also is an impact to our mental health, which means that we're then needing to put in extra work, not only to heal our own experiences in our day-to-day life, but sometimes we're healing things from stuff that we don't even know about, stuff that happened to our parents that we were not privy to, but we're still living through it, you know? And then we're doing that work of healing not only our generation, but the generation before us. And sometimes I think that can cause grief, you know, which is why we wanted to pair the conversation with generational trauma with grief, because that can cause grief, and it can cause us to feel a sense of loss of childhood. It can cause us to feel a sense of this burden that we have to not only heal for ourselves, but that we have to heal for the generations prior. And the challenge is sometimes that those generations, not because they didn't want to, but didn't always have access, which is why we pair this conversation not only with talking about family, but talking about systems. So how are some of the systems that were in place actually impacting our parental units and their access to care? And through not having access to care, some of them did not have access to do some of the healing work that would have been definitely beneficial for them in their own journey, so they were able to create an environment that's more conducive to mental wellness for us as their offspring and as their children. So that's some of the work that comes with looking at generational trauma, is looking at our experiences of trauma, not only as their experiences for our day-to-day life, but thinking about how those experiences are also linked to our family units, also linked to the systems that continue to make it really hard for us. And in conversation on, particularly on anti-Blackness, then there's conversation on PTSD, right? And can anti-Blackness be linked to PTSD? What does it mean to be a Black person navigating daily society on a day-to-day basis? How is that process and that navigation of day-to-day society also causing us to have experiences of PTSD, which could look like having flashbacks, which could look like the anxiety that sometimes comes with just wanting to leave our house and navigate life, knowing that we have to navigate streets day to day as a Black person. And some of that is also linked to generational trauma in terms of the fact that our parents who have had to work within societies as a Black person, a Black body, what has that taught them? I think about my mother and how my mother has coped with being a Black woman, oftentimes through this level of submission to what is going on. So it's been really hard for her at times in life. It's been really hard for us together because I wanted to challenge things, and for her, she gets really scared. And I get it. Like, I get why she gets scared. She gets really scared when I push back and I challenge what is status quo, whether it being workplaces or at school, when I was in school, because for her, that challenging was linked to a fear of not surviving. And it was a real fear, you know. It's not something that is made up. There's things that folks have lived through. So that becomes a form to itself of trying to navigate a level of PTSD that comes from anti-Blackness, and how she then has created these restrictions for me as her child and as her daughter to want me to navigate the world in a way that's a little bit more submissive, in hopes that if I, you know, stay quiet, stay in my lane, do my role, then I will have an easier life, you know? And for me, it's come with time that I've come to a place where I'm like, I get it. I get why she has wanted to create this, I guess, of submission for me to get me to live an easier life that she didn't necessarily always have access to. And I think that this is the hard part, is that this grief often comes side by side with generational trauma. And then what do we do about grief, especially for those of us who constantly are grieving? I think to live in this world with intersections such as Blackness or womanhood or femme identities, there's a constant level of trying to navigate our gender and our race all the time. And that, for me at least, I'll speak for myself, does come with a certain level of grief involved, a certain level of feeling like there's a loss. There's something that I either, even just thinking about childhood, the ways that like Black little girls don't get access to being Black little girls, and the loss that comes along with that. For me, I would say it was a loss of feeling like I had access to the childhood that I would have ideally wanted to have access to. And so what do we do about that as we become women? How do we make space for that grief? So for me, making space for the grief of a loss of childhood means making space for play. And grief is energy. And I think that because grief is energy, it's really helpful when we make space for that energy to move through us and not necessarily hold it. And I think that sometimes we try to just get past it, and we have to go back to it to address where the grief got stuck in our body. And play is a way that I have learned to do that, to actually make space for laughter and play in my life, whether it be with friends or my partner or even by myself. How do I bring a certain level of like joyfulness and giddiness to my life in the ways that I would have wanted to have access to it as a child, you know, and carving out specific space for that is a way that I have come to navigate grief, particularly grief connected to childhood traumas and childhood traumas that are connected to intergenerational traumas. And when it comes to grief, there's also this level of like realizing that grief is not linear. I think that in learning about these 5 stages of grief, we sometimes feel like grief is this linear journey, and that when we grieve, we only grieve in one direction. And sometimes grief means going backwards. Like there's things that happened to me so many years ago, like 20 years ago, and I'm still grieving them, you know? And it's in spaces like therapy that I've been able to have really honest dialogue about that grief and say, you know what? I need to go backwards for a minute. I need to step back and access that space and see what's still left there, and how do I make space to grieve that. So that for me has looked like writing letters. Sometimes you got to write letters to your past self. Sometimes you got to write letters to people, you know, that you might not have those conversations with, but because the grief is still lingering in our bodies, we have to go back to it and make space for it and really address what's there. Because what happens with grief is, whether we want to or not, whether we address it or not, it still takes a space in our life. And when we don't go back and address it, it still comes out in other ways, whether in our relationships or our connections or our friendships, our work relationships. That grief still shows itself in other ways. So it's important that if there are things that have happened in the past, that we go back and we address it to the best of our ability. And also realizing that grief looks like different things, and giving ourselves permission to grieve. Sometimes we think grief is only around deaths, and that we should only be grieving really large things. And this idea, well, nobody died, you know, and when we're grieving something that seems smaller. But sometimes grief is because we have to move from one stage of life to another. And although we're grateful for the transition and the growth, we grieve the past, and that's okay. And sometimes grief looks like the end of a friendship that was so deeply meaningful to us, and that's okay as well. And sometimes grief looks like, for me at least, I'm thinking about some of the smaller things that I've had to grieve, the loss of something that was special to me, even if it's an inanimate object, that it held significance to me emotionally, and I've had to move forward and move on from it, sometimes because I actually lost it, and that brings grief. And I think that because our bodies don't always know the difference, you know, and oftentimes we hold grief in our body, the grief from one thing that seems like a small thing can trigger the emotions of the grief from a larger thing, which is why, in my humble opinion, when things happen in society, like we lose celebrities and people start crying, we're like, why are you crying over that? It's like, actually, we're crying because that grief triggered the realization that life is this finite gift. And sometimes that grief triggers the realization that we're still grieving somebody else that we lost in the past, maybe an aunt, an uncle, so on and so forth, family member, a friend, whatever, you know, sometimes it's another celebrity, but it's just like that grief is not only for itself. One grief can trigger something else. And I know for myself, as a person who is still working at having the ability to, you know, tap into my grief, because I think that living in Toronto, we can sometimes get into a point where we're so busy on the move, doing the next thing, that we don't take time out that we need to grieve properly. And I know for myself that with my busy schedule, I don't always take the time out I need. And some of the ways I do that is when I realize, okay, I need to have a good cry, and I don't always know how to access or tap into that. I carve out a Friday evening to be like, I'm gonna watch these sad movies and I'm gonna let myself cry. And it's important that we find ways to tap into that experience of grief and give ourselves space to grieve, even if it's not directly for what we might think that we need to grieve for. Because again, it's this thing that just lives in our bodies. And part of the powerful way of navigating this unlinear thing that can sometimes build up from multiple events is by having multiple tools to navigate it, by having multiple ways to have the conversation with yourself, by having multiple ways to cry, by having multiple ways to have some kind of catharsis and release. So if that means you journal and you watch movies so you can cry, if that means that you go for long walks, which walks can be a form of meditation and be able to process things, if that means that you have a standing date with yourself, so a day that you put in your calendar that you carve out, that you're like, this is the day that's for me, and you give yourself time to process as best as possible on that day. There's so many ways to navigate this, but really the big takeaway is that because there's so many ways so many things that we have to grieve for, realistically, it's important to have multiple ways of addressing said grief, and that we're not limiting ourselves in what we think we have access to as a means of addressing said grief, especially because we know that we're rarely just grieving one thing, and we're rarely just grieving something that happened in a moment. We're often grieving from multiple things from various points of life, and sometimes those things are not only from our current standpoint, but things that we're grieving for, that from our parents and what has happened to them in the past. So that's just a quick note on grief and the ways that grief can show up and look different in our life. And my hope is that as we start to have more of these dialogues around particularly Black mental health, we start to make more space for talking about how our identities are connected to some of this grief, that some of this grief are things that are connected to Blackness, and that we would not have had some of these experiences outside of the Black experience. So we need to make sure that we are accessing and tapping into specifically Black spaces. And that's something that I have found really helpful, even just being at the Adornment Stories workshops, having spaces that specifically are Black. Because in our workshops, I hear folks talking about their experiences of strong Black womanhood and the complex around that, and feeling like they can't lean on anybody because they are the person in their life that everybody thinks should have the answer, should know, and should be able to handle anything. And in being in those spaces, we're able to look at each other and be like, oh, you have that too, and see that we're not alone in this experience. And that, again, some of these experiences are so unique to our identities that it can have us feeling like there's something wrong with us, or like we have some kind of issue, when in reality what we're doing is navigating and reacting to circumstances that often are being imposed onto us, whether because of cultural reasons or systemic reasons, but we're constantly trying to navigate what those circumstances are. So that's my quick note. I'm gonna wrap up, but I just wanted to come here and say hello to you all, and just, drop a quick note about the ways in which the connection between intergenerational trauma and grief show up in our lives, and what are some of the things that we can do to continue to show up for ourselves, and if anything, just affirm for ourselves that these realities are real and these are really things that are happening, and it's not just in our head, and it's in that these connections we build with each other are so important. The time we take for ourselves to work through this stuff is so important. So I hope that you are having a great lunch hour, and if you are at work, you are having a great work day. And I thank you. And I shall talk to y'all soon. We have so much fun stuff coming down line for y'all. And we can't wait to share it with you. Talk soon. Love y'all. Peace.